Oh. Here's a fish update for you. Here are fish swimming around. They're getting bigger. Keeping them around for you guys, so when you come back, you guys can see them. Hopefully we can take them to some creek or something and put them out. So there they are, swimming around, having a good time. Well, they probably miss you guys. Where'd all those funny-looking kids go? All right, let's see. So we are on chapter 9 this morning. Why Peter Rabbit wears a white patch. Let's see. The Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind had been tumbled out of her bag very early this morning. Indeed, they were hardly awake when Old Mother West Wind shook them out on the Green Meadows and hurried away to her day's work, for she knew it was to be a very busy day. The Merry Little Breezes had watched her go. They saw the great windmill in Farmer Brown's barnyard begin to swirl as she passed. They saw the million little leaves of the green forest shake until a million little drops of dew, like a million little diamonds, fell down to earth. And then Old Mother West Wind disappeared on her way to the great ocean, where there to blow the white-winged ships along their way all day long. The Merry Little Breezes stretched themselves and then began to dance across the green meadow to kiss the buttercups and daisies and waken the sleepy little meadow people who hadn't got their nightcaps off yet. But no one wanted to play so early in the morning. No, sir, no one wanted to play. You see, everyone had something more important to do. They loved the Merry Little Breezes, but they just couldn't stop to play. Finally, the Merry Little Breezes gave it up and just curled up among the grasses for a sun nap. That is, all but one did. That one kept hoping every few minutes to see that someone was in sight. That one kept hopping up every few minutes to see if anyone was in sight who would be likely to play a little while. By and by, Peter Rabbit was coming down the lone little path from the Green Forest on his way to the dear old briar patch on the Green Meadow. Peter looked sleepy. The truth is, Peter had been out all night, and he was on his way home. Halfway down the lone little path, Peter stopped, and, sitting up very straight, looked over toward the Smiling Pool. He could see Mr. Redwing flying round and round, this way and that way over the bulrushes. He could hear Mr. Redwing's voice, and it sounded as if Mr. Redwing was very much excited. The more Peter looked and listened, and the more certain he became that something very important must have happened over in the bulrushes on the edge of the Smiling Pool. Now, curiosity is Peter Rabbit's besetting sin. Sleepy as he was, he just couldn't go home first without finding out what had happened over on the bulrushes. So away Peter started for the Smiling Pool, lipperty-slip. Of course, the Merry Little Breezes saw him go. So then the Merry Little Breeze waked all the other Merry Little Breezes up, and away they all danced across the Green Meadows to the Smiling Pool and stole in among the bulrushes behind Peter Rabbit to see what he was about. They came up just in time to hear Peter say, "Hello, Mr. Redwing. You seem very much excited this fine morning. What is it all about? Has anything happened?" Mr. Redwing hovered right over Peter Rabbit. "Tra-la-lee, Cherokee, I'm happy, oh so happy, I'm happy as can be," sang Mr. Redwing, looking down at Peter, who was sitting very straight and looking up. "You seem to be, but what is it all about? What is it that makes you so happy this morning, Mr. Redwing?" Peter asked. "Tra-la-lee, Cherokee, we've another speckled egg, and this one makes it 3, caroled Mr. Redwing, and flew over to the nest in the bulrushes where Mrs. Redwing was fussing about in a very important manner. "Pooh," said Peter Rabbit, "is that all? What a little thing to make such a fuss about. I think I'll pay my respects to Grandfather Frog, and then I'll go home." Peter yawned. Then he hopped out where he could see all over the Smiling Pool, and there sat Grandfather Frog on his big green lily pad just as usual. "Good morning, Grandfather Frog," said Peter Rabbit. "Chug-a-rum! Of course it's a good morning. Every morning is good," replied Grandfather Frog roughly. "Oh," said Peter Rabbit, and then he couldn't think of anything else to say. The Merry Little Breezes giggled, and Grandfather Frog looked over at them very slowly and winked. Then he rolled up his big googly eyes and stared into the sky. Peter Rabbit looked up to see what Grandfather Frog was looking at so intently. There was Redtail the hawk swinging around in round in great circles as if he were trying to bore his way right into the clouds. Peter didn't stop to watch. When old Mr. Hawk is a-riding in the sky, keep a-movin', keep a-movin', keep a-movin', mighty spry, chanted Peter, and taking his own advice, off he went lipperty-lipperty-lip. Grandfather Frog watched the white patch on the seat of Peter's pants, bobbing through the rushes until finally Peter was out of sight. Did you ever hear how Peter Rabbit happens to always wear a white patch on the seat of his pants? Asked Grandfather Frog. No, do tell us, exclaimed the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind. Grandfather Frog snapped up a foolish green fly, smacked his lips, cleared his throat, and began. Once upon a time when the world was young, Old Mother Nature found she had her hands full. Yes, sir, she certainly did have her hands full. Her family was so big that she couldn't keep an eye on each one all the time. Dear me, such a lot of trouble Old Mother Nature did have in those days. And no one had made her more trouble than Peter's grandfather, 1,000 times removed. Mr. Rabbit was always in mischief. He just naturally couldn't keep out of it. He just hopped out of one scrape and right plumb into another. Seemed like Old Mother Nature was kept busy just straightening out trouble Mr. Rabbit had made. Even she wasn't always quite sure who had made it, and no one else suspected Mr. Rabbit at all. He wore a brown coat, just like the brown leaves, and when he ran, he looked just like a little old bunch of leaves blowing along. So Mr. Rabbit used to creep up and listen to what others were saying, for he was just as curious as Peter Rabbit is now. He's a busybody. And he used to play all kinds of tricks and never get caught because of that old brown suit of his. One day, in early spring, when gentle Sister South Wind had melted all the snow except a little patch right under the window of Mr. Skunk's house, Mr. Rabbit came strolling along that way with nothing special on his mind. Mr. and Mrs. Skunk were having a little family talk, and Mr. Skunk was speaking some loud. Mr. Rabbit stopped. Then Mr. Rabbit grinned and sat right down on that bed of snow under Mr. Skunk's window. There he could hear every word. Mr. Rabbit had been sitting there some time, listening to things that were none of his business, when he happened to look up. There was Old Mother Nature coming through the woods. She hadn't seen him yet, and Mr. Rabbit didn't mean that she should. Off he ran as fast as he could through the brown leaves, chuckling to himself, but Mr. Rabbit had forgotten to brush off the seat of his pants, and of course they were all white with snow. Old Mother Nature's eyes are sharp, and so of course she saw that white spot bobbing through the bushes, saw it right away. Mr. Rabbit had to stop and tell what he had been doing to get the seat of his pants all white with snow. And he told the truth, for it is no use to tell anything else to Old Mother Nature. She looked very stern, and she opened her mouth to tell Mr. Rabbit what she thought of him, and just then she had an idea. She just marched Mr. Rabbit off and sewed a white patch on the seat of his pants. And after that, when Mr. Rabbit tried to run away from the mischief he got into, everyone knew who it was by the white patch on the seat of his pants. And from that day on to this day, the Mr. Rabbit's family have worn a white patch, and that is why Peter wears one now. And whenever he stops running, if it is only for a minute, sits down on it so it cannot be seen, concluded Grandfather Frog. Thank you, Grandfather Frog, cried the Merry Little Breezes, and hurried to see who would be first to blow a big, fat, foolish green fly within reach of Grandfather Frog's big mouth. Interesting. So basically, don't be a busybody and get into other people's business. All right, our next chapter here is called Who Stole the Eggs of Mrs. Grouse? A grouse is a bird, like kind of a middle between like a turkey and like a chicken, sort of. Like they lay eggs, I think, that you can eat. Like large enough, like that kind of size. There was a great excitement in the Green Forest and on the Green Meadows. The Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind brought the news. They got it from Mrs. Grouse herself. They had found her very early in the morning, almost distracted with grief. She had lost her eggs. Yes, sir, someone had stolen all her eggs, 15 of them, and she was in despair. She knew that they were stolen by someone who lived in the Green Forest, and not by Farmer Brown's boy, because he had not been in the Green Forest that afternoon. She had left the nest only for a few minutes, so that she might get the cramps out of her legs. When she came back, not an egg was to be seen. Peter Rabbit hurried to call on Mrs. Grouse as soon as he heard the news. She told the dreadful story all over again, and Peter was so sympathetic that when she cried, he cried a little too. Now Peter is sharp-eyed, and all the time he was listening to Mrs. Grouse, he was examining everything in sight, kind of like a detective, sort of. What he saw, he kept to himself. Pretty soon he excused himself and started down to Johnny Chuck's house. He found Johnny Chuck very busy making a new path. "Hello, Johnny Chuck. Have you heard about the eggs of Mrs. Grouse?" asked Peter. "Sure," said Johnny Chuck. "The Merry Little Breezes were so full of it that they couldn't talk of anything else this morning." "Who do you suppose did it?" "I don't suppose," said Peter. "I know." Ooh, he's got his ideas, apparently. Oh, here's a picture of Mrs. Grouse. Let me show you. Mrs. Grouse. Johnny Chuck grinned. "Look out, Peter. You'll know too much someday," said he, for Peter is famous for thinking that he knows everything. "I tell you I do know," exclaimed Peter indignantly. "You mean you think you know," replied Johnny Chuck. "No such thing. I tell you I know who stole those eggs." Peter fairly shouted. "Did you see the thief?" asked Johnny Chuck. "No," replied Peter. "Or the stolen eggs?" asked Johnny. "No," replied Peter. "Then how do you know who stole them?" demanded Johnny. "Because I found his tracks, that's how," said Peter. "Well, who do you think the thief is?" asked Johnny. Peter tiptoed up and whispered in one of Johnny's ears. "I don't believe it," said Johnny Chuck. "Jimmy Skunk wouldn't do such a mean thing as that." "I tell you, I saw his tracks right around the nest," replied Peter. "I don't care if you did. He never—" Johnny Chuck didn't finish, for there, coming down the Lone Little Path, was Jimmy Skunk himself. And on the front of his coat was a yellow stain. It certainly seemed very much like an egg. The news that Jimmy Skunk had done, or what Peter Rabbit thought he had done, spread all over the Green Meadow and through the Green Forest, and no one would have anything to do with Jimmy. This is probably a lesson about don't talk about other people and spread rumors and lies. I wonder if Jimmy Skunk really did it or not. When he met Peter Rabbit, Peter turned his back on him. When he met Johnny Chuck, Johnny didn't see him. When he met Sammy Jay, Sammy yelled at the top of his lungs, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" It took Jimmy a long time to get through his head that they were really thought that he was a thief. And when he did realize it, he didn't know what he didn't know what they thought he had stolen. He couldn't very well ask, for no one would speak to him. Jimmy Skunk lost his appetite. A beetle would run right out and under Jimmy's nose, and he would never know it. He grew thin. The more he worried, the thinner he grew, and he grew cross and short-tempered. Why, even Danny Meadow Mouse, who turned his nose up at Jimmy when he passed, and Jimmy knew it. Jimmy's thoughts were anything but pleasant thoughts, as one day he started down the crooked little path to the Green Meadows. Jimmy is naturally a lazy, good-natured, happy little fellow, and ready to make friends with anyone. This treatment he was receiving was more than he could bear. "If only I knew what all this was about," he muttered to himself. Just then he heard some voices over behind a bush, and he thought he heard his own name. He stopped to listen. Of course, this wasn't a nice thing to do, but when Jimmy heard his own name, he just had to try to hear a little more. "I tell you, I saw his tracks all around the nest of Mrs. Grouse, and I saw egg stain on the front of his coat." It was Peter Rabbit who was speaking. A great light, broke out over Jimmy Skunk. So that was what the matter was, and that was why they turned their backs on him and called him a thief. They thought he was the one who had stolen the eggs from Mrs. Grouse. What right did they to think of that? For Jimmy grew indignant. Then he thought of what he had heard Peter say. Jimmy gave a long whistle and sat down to think. It certainly did look bad. He had been around the nest the very morning that the eggs were stolen. He remembered looking for beetles right under the old log back where Mrs. Grouse had been sitting. And he had spilled egg on his coat. And then had been in such a hurry to get home he had not had taken time to wash it off. But the egg came from Farmer Brown's hen house. "I guess I don't blame them very much after all," said Jimmy when he thought it over. "And I guess the only way I can prove it wasn't me is to find out who it was." Now that Jimmy knew what the trouble was, he made up his mind that he would just turn policeman and find out who really did steal those eggs. He sat down to think it all over. "Peter Rabbit doesn't eat eggs, and neither does Jimmy Chuck," said Jimmy. Danny Meadow Mouse might eat a wee one, but he would never have stolen all of those. Jimmy laughed at the thought. Striped Chipmunk couldn't have done it, and Chatterer the Red Squirrel couldn't have kept still about it. It might have been Billy Mink, or... Jimmy Skunk drew a long breath, then he sprang to his feet. I believe that it is just who it is, he exclaimed. Now Jimmy Skunk naturally is lazy, but this time he acted promptly. He brushed his coat carefully and made himself as fine as he could. Then he started out to make some calls. He first stopped at Johnny Chuck's house, but Johnny Chuck had seen him coming, and when Jimmy knocked, Johnny pretended that he wasn't at home. Jimmy grinned and went on. At almost every house he was treated in just the same way. When he had called, or tried to call, on most of the little people of the Green Meadows and Green Forest, he had made up his mind that none of these was the thief, for it was plain to see that they held him all guilty. Jimmy chuckled to himself as he thought over the way he had been received. Well, anyway, I know who it wasn't, and that is something. Now to find out who it was, and he said as he started to the Laughing Brook. Coming down the Laughing Brook from the Smiling Pool, he met Billy Mink. Billy had a fat trout with which he was taking home. He laid it down and said, "Howdy," to Jimmy Skunk, for Billy Mink is often in mischief, and that he cannot afford to turn his back on others. Besides, he's sort of a second cousin of Jimmy Skunk. "Howdy," said Jimmy Skunk. "I suppose that your storehouse is full of fat trout, Billy Mink." Billy scowled. "It was," he replied, "but that thieving cousin of ours, Shadow the Weasel, stole it yesterday. I caught him, and I guess he wishes now he hadn't. He isn't smart enough to catch his own fish, so he steals from his own cousins." "I thought Shadow the Weasel had gone on a long journey," said Jimmy. "He's been back a week," replied Billy shortly. "Well, I best be going. Goodbye." "Goodbye," replied Jimmy Skunk, and with a light heart he started back for the crooked little path up the hill, for he had found out what he wanted to know. Shadow the Weasel was back in the Green Forest. Jimmy went on the top of the crooked little path and then sat down to watch Old Mother West Wind gather her Merry Little Breezes into her bag, in which she would carry them to her home behind the purple hills. As he watched, Jimmy would sometimes look over the farmers and chuckle. Look towards Farmer Brown's and chuckle. He was waiting for the black shadows to creep out from the purple hills. By and by he saw them coming, creeping slowly out across the Green Meadows, and up the crooked little path to his very feet. When it was growing dark enough, Jimmy Skunk arose and started for Farmer Brown's hen house. He knew just where the very nest was, for he had been there many times before. And the second one he looked into was a nice brown egg. It made Jimmy's mouth water, for Jimmy is very fond of eggs. But he closed his lips tightly and picked up the egg. Then he crept out of the hen house and hurried, which is something very unusual for Jimmy, over to the Green Forest, where he hid the egg in a hollow stump. Then back he hurried for another egg. 3 times he made the trip to Farmer Brown's hen house, and 3 times he brought back an egg to put in the hollow stump. I wonder what he's doing. By this time, Jimmy Skunk was tired, but he couldn't stop to rest now. Down the Laughing Brook he hurried, and there he found Billy Mink. "Hi, Billy Mink, I want a fish," said Jimmy Skunk. Billy Mink laughed. "Catch it, then," he cried. "Come here, I want to whisper something," replied Jimmy Skunk. Billy Mink came over and listened. Then he grinned. "All right," he said. "I'll do anything to get even with Shadow the Weasel." So presently, Billy Mink, who was a famous fisherman, brought Jimmy Skunk a fat fish, and Jimmy thanked him. And he dragged it up through the Green Forest and finally put it in the hollow stump with the eggs. Then, when he was done, he hurried off to find Peter Rabbit and Johnny Chuck. For it was then just the beginning of the morning, and it was hard work, but he finally got them to come up and hide with him near the hollow stump. They had been there a little while when they heard a rustling of leaves. Jimmy reached over and poked Peter Rabbit. There was the Shadow the Weasel, running his nose on the ground, following the smell of the fish where Jimmy Skunk had dragged the trout that Billy Mink had given him. Straight up to the hollow stump went Shadow the Weasel. He peeped inside. Then he looked all around to see if anyone was watching. He didn't see Jimmy Skunk and Peter Rabbit and Johnny Chuck. "My!" exclaimed Shadow the Weasel. "These are better than the eggs of Mrs. Grouse!" And he disappeared in the hollow stump. Peter Rabbit looked at Jimmy Skunk. Then he held out his hand. "I'm sorry, Jimmy, that I ever thought it was you who stole the eggs of Mrs. Grouse." Now I'm going to hurry and tell everyone on the Green Meadows and in the Green Forest who it really was. And Peter was as good as his word, so that everyone hurried to tell Jimmy Skunk how much they thought of him. So, yep, I definitely take from this chapter, don't go saying things about someone else, because you just don't know. Don't spread rumors. You can get people into a lot of trouble. All right, well, that's it for today, guys. I will see you all tomorrow. Trying to think of anything, really. I can't think of a whole lot. Just have a good day, y'all. It's gonna be windy today, I think, so make sure to take care. I'll see you guys later.